All right, we are in week 11 of our stories through Genesis. We've started with creation, and now we are in the final chapters of Genesis, the things that, the high points and low points of the narrative of the first 2,000 years of history have been fascinating. And before I get into the text today, I wanted to tell you about this older couple. They had been married for 50 years, which actually we have Russ and Shar who celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary just yesterday. So happy anniversary, you guys. This story is not about them, even though this couple has been married for 50 years. Let's just say this couple in this story is much older than you guys. But there was this older couple, and they were losing their memory. You know, it happens. And they say memory is the first thing to go, either that or hearing. Huh? But one evening, they were just kind of sitting at home, and the wife had a craving. She said, "You know what? I want some Dairy Queen. Do you want to get anything? If you run and get the Dairy Queen, I'll buy." And they're like, we've been married for 50 years. Of course, it's whatever. But husband said, "Okay, I'll go to Dairy Queen and get you what you want. What do you want?" And she said, "I want a medium Blizzard with vanilla ice cream, cherries, and cheesecake bites." And he's like, "I got it." And she's like, "Write it down." "No, I've got it. You want a medium Blizzard with cheesecake bites and cherries, vanilla ice cream." She's like, "Yeah, write it down." "Woman, I've got this. We've been married 50 years. I think I know what you like." And she's like, "We've been married 50 years. I know how forgetful you are." Like, whatever. So he leaves. He goes to the store. About 30 minutes later, he comes back in. And he has a white paper bag, and he brings it over and gives it to her. And the paper bag is familiar. It's a Chick-fil-A bag. She opens the Chick-fil-A bag, and down inside is a Chick-fil-A sandwich and waffle fries. And she just shakes her head, looks over at him and said, "I told you to write it down. I knew you would forget." And he's like, "Forget what? I got exactly what you wanted." And she said, "You forgot to tell him no pickle." You ever forget something? Yeah. How about something important? Yeah, it happens. I'm a forgetful person sometimes. I used to not be that way, but I'm starting to notice the older I get, the more things just aren't as clear as they once were. I forget names or appointments or something that I said I'd do, which is weird because I seem to have a whole lot of space in my mind for song lyrics from the 80s and 90s. In fact, because of that, there's sometimes when I'm around certain people that I have to forget on purpose, or I have to pretend to forget something. Like if I hear that familiar beat, I have to pretend to forget that I know every word to a certain Vanilla Ice song. All right, stop. Collaborate and listen. Ice is back with a brand new invention. Something, never mind. Like that. But we forget things all the time. We're forgetful people, and whether it's intentional, we're trying to forget, or some things just slip our mind. Either if it's forgetting to pick up milk on the way home, or forgetting to pay a bill. You paid all your bills, but that one, and you get a late notice, or maybe it's something a little more significant, and you forgot your spouse's anniversary, or somebody's birthday, or whatever. We forget things. And even though some of those are bigger deals than others, they're somewhat trivial. But the reality is we don't just forget little things. Sometimes we forget completely about people. And that's when the forgetting becomes serious. That's when it begins to hurt feelings. More specifically, we have a really tough time when we feel like we've been forgotten by someone. We put so much of our value and our self-worth into what other people think of us that when we feel like someone has forgotten us, it really stings. Some of you may feel like you've been overlooked on your job. You worked hard someone else ends up taking credit for it, or they get a promotion. And it hurts when you've been forgotten by your boss. Maybe you're looking for a job right now and nobody's calling you back and you feel forgotten. Or you have relationships. You look and see, maybe you're on social media and you see some of your close friends went out and had a good time and you were forgotten. They didn't invite you to come along. Or your kids, you've got grown kids and they don't call like they used to, and you feel like you are forgotten even by your own children. It's tough to feel forgotten. You might have even come in here today feeling like you've been forgotten by God. Whatever the circumstances that got you to this point, you feel forgotten. There's that forgotten feeling. And that just kind of sums up where you are in life right now. Abandoned, forgotten, neglected. Looking back over the past few weeks, we've done a lot of weeks through Genesis, but the last couple of weeks, this week and next week, were specifically about Joseph. Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, firstborn of Jacob's wife Rachel, who was his favorite of his wives. And Jacob made it obvious that Joseph was his favorite. He put the coat of many colors on him, which symbolized that he was different, that he was above the other brothers. And it was a constant reminder to his 10 older brothers that Dad loved him more. And on top of that, God gave Joseph dreams. And these dreams showed how his whole family would one day bow down to him. And that just amped up all the tensions. Then we see how Joseph was sold by those brothers into slavery, and they lied to their father so that he would think that Joseph was torn apart by a wild beast. The brothers think they got away with this because there's no way they'll ever see him again, and Jacob is mourning and grieving the death of his son, and it's in that time that Joseph is forgotten by his family. Out of sight, out of mind. Jacob never really forgot him, but he knew that he wouldn't see him anymore. So that's the first one we have. Joseph was forgotten by his family. Then last week we saw how Joseph was sold again. He was sold to these traveling merchants. Then he was sold in Egypt to the captain of the guard named Potiphar. Potiphar was an influential person. He was someone who a lot of the high-ranking officials in the government would have been at his house. And Joseph was a slave, but he was favored in that situation so that he became the chief of staff of Potiphar's house and got to be in the circles with a lot of important people in Egypt. He becomes a person of influence himself. That's when Potiphar's wife takes notice of his good looks. She tries time and time again to seduce him, even making it so that nobody else is in the house, so he has no way that he can push an excuse off on anything else. And Joseph, in that moment, runs out of there, and his garment was left behind. And even in that moment, God provided a way of escape for him. And God will always provide a way of escape, even if that means physically running away. And that's where we continue our story today. Genesis 39, beginning in verse 11. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there, she, Potiphar's wife, caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. As soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. As soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. So we have Joseph there, who is long forgotten by his family at this point. It had been 20 years since he had been sold as a slave by his brothers. And he'd been successful, but he was still not where God needed him to be. So he finds himself in prison. But even in prison, his story sounds familiar. The next verse, 21. But the Lord was with Joseph, and he showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made succeed. Father, thank you for your word today. Lord, you have taken Joseph through all of these cycles and ups and downs and times of success and times of seeming failure. But every step of the way, you were with him. When he was forgotten by his family, you were with him. When he was forgotten in prison, you were with him. Father, encourage us today that we are on your mind, because nothing slips your mind. You are not forgetful about us at all. Anoint us as we hear the word. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we are going to cover a lot of space in the Bible today, at least as far as the book of Genesis goes. There's 50 chapters, so I encourage you read all of the chapters 39, 40, 41. For time's sake, I'm going to kind of just breeze through it and hit some of the highlights here to drive at the point. Next week, we're going to end our time through Genesis, but this week I want us to drill down to see what all takes place when Joseph feels forgotten. He's in prison, and he meets two of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer or the butler, as some translations call, and a baker. And these were like high-ranking officials in Pharaoh's court, and whatever they had done caused them to be in the same prison as Joseph. They both have dreams on the same night. Don't understand them. Joseph comes in and he sees that their faces are down. He can tell there's something not quite right with them. And in verse 8, we pick up the story there in Genesis 40, verse 8. They said to him, "We have had dreams. There's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So Joseph heard their dreams, and he told them the meanings of their dreams. God divinely had set him as a person who could understand those sorts of things. As a kid, he had been given dreams about his brothers bowing down, and then his parents bowing down as well. Chiefs were bowing down. The sun and moon and the stars were bowing down. So Joseph had experience with this, and in this moment, God reawakened that gift within him, and as he heard the dreams, he gave them the interpretation. Good news for the cupbearer: you're going back to the palace. You're going to get your job back in 3 days. Bad news for the baker: in 3 days, you're going to be executed. 3 days later, that's exactly what happened. It came to pass exactly as Joseph said, that the interpretation of the dream. Joseph had one request, and we see that in verse 14. "Only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house." That's not what happened. Going down a few verses, verse 23, we see, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him." He forgot Joseph. So Joseph was forgotten by his family. Now he is forgotten by the cupbearer or by the butler. Joseph is now off the grid completely. Potiphar had put him in prison, so I'm sure Potiphar's wife had moved on to whatever else was going on. Joseph was off the grid. He was forgotten. The only other person that would have remembered him, that could have done anything about it, was the baker, and he was dead. He's forgotten until one day Pharaoh has a dream that nobody else can interpret. Then the cupbearer remembers. Oh, yeah. Oh, and he feels bad. You know the feeling when you've been reminded of something that you really didn't want to forget. Maybe you missed an appointment or something, and you're like, oh, no. Oh, I missed it. A few years ago, I was forgetful about certain things, and appointments were a big one. And I had my calendar, had everything. I even had notifications on my calendar to remind me of certain things. And this was back when telehealth was just gaining popularity coming out of COVID. I prepaid for a doctor's appointment on telehealth, and I had a reminder. It reminded me 30 minutes before my appointment. And I'm like, awesome. I got distracted. An hour and a half later, I got another notification. You missed your appointment. And so I lost the money that I had put up for that telehealth doctor and ended up having to schedule it again. But that moment when I got that second notification that I missed my appointment, that feeling was like, oh, because it cost me money, because it cost me time. It was just this disappointment feeling. And I can imagine the butler, the cupbearer, when he realizes that he forgot, and it's much higher stakes than just forgetting an appointment. Because of his forgetfulness, he left Joseph in prison for years. But in chapter 41, picking it up, verse 8, so in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called the magicians of Egypt. This is Pharaoh in his dream. He called all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. The chief cupbearer then said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants, he put me and the chief baker in custody of the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I having the same dream, or each having a dream with its own interpretation. And a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams for us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. Pharaoh learns of it and immediately get him out of the pit. I'm certain he went and was cleaned up. He's not going to go to Pharaoh coming out of a grimy prison looking like that. But Joseph comes before Pharaoh. He interprets the dream, and the dream, it comes true. It's exactly the way that God gave the dream to Pharaoh, so that it could all work out, that Joseph would be there to interpret the dream. And in that dream, there's 7 years of abundance. There's 7 fat cows that come out of the Nile River. 7 years of abundance. There's going to be double the harvest. But then after that, there are these 7 lean cows that come out, and they devour the fatted ones. And so that represented 7 years of famine. And it wouldn't just be like food would be scarce. It was legitimate famine that extends beyond just Egypt. And so Joseph gives the interpretation, and he advises Pharaoh in that moment, during the 7 years of increase, put someone in charge of that double harvest to store up the supplies. And then in the 7 years of famine, then whoever it is that's in charge can take that extra and can sell to the Egyptians and eventually to those that are experiencing the famine outside of Egypt. So this idea increased Pharaoh's power by the way people would come. They would sell their land. They would give whatever they had. Pharaoh's power was increased because of Joseph's idea of selling the grain during the times of lean. And because God gave Pharaoh the dream and he gave Joseph the interpretation, God was in that moment setting Joseph up for being the savior of not only Egypt, but of his own people and the lineage of his great-grandfather Abraham. So all that takes place. Pharaoh puts Joseph as the guy in charge of running all of that. So Joseph has gone from being sold out of a pit. He goes from being thrown into a prison, and now he's been relocated to the palace. All three of these stages of his life where he had ups and downs. And he's now the second most powerful person in, at the time, what was at the time the most powerful nation on earth. And so the story, it takes up 12 chapters of Genesis. And it's a lengthy story. And we've gone through it pretty quickly. But I do all that because I'm setting up what I want to take us to in this next moment. When we look and see the entirety of Joseph's life, we see the big picture and how he was forgotten by everyone around him. So what does that mean for me? What can we learn from Joseph's life where he's been forgotten? He's been forgotten by his family. He's been forgotten by the butler, by the one who could help him out. Well, we see that even when he was forgotten, the first thing we see is that God was with him. Even though he was forgotten, God was there. Back in chapter 39, verses 2 and verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. Down in verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. All of these ups and downs, God did not abandon Joseph. He was with him every day, in every way that he was there. It may have even seemed like God had forgotten him, but he did not forsake God because he knew that God would not turn on him. If you feel like you've been forgotten by God, understand he has not lost track of you. God does not forget his children. The only forgetting that God ever does is when he forgets your sin. When you give him, you lay down your burdens, that sin is covered in the blood of his son Jesus. In that moment, he does not see that sin anymore. The Bible describes it as our transgressions being cast as far as the east is from the west. God it does not hold forgiven sin against you. That's what he forgets. And it's on purpose he does it. So God was with Joseph. The next thing that we see is that being forgotten by others actually allowed God to position Joseph for what his purpose was. When Joseph was forgotten by his family, it seems terrible even to think of how his family treated him. And we talked about first week when we talked about Joseph, the pain of rejection and being rejected by those who should have loved him, who should have been the ones to teach and mentor him and raise him up, his older brothers. But he was sold into slavery. But because he was forgotten by them, that positioned him for what was next. God got him out of a situation where they wanted to kill him. The brothers were like, let's just do it, let's just kill him, do away with it. One of the brothers is like, no, let's not do that. Let's just put him in a pit, and we wanted to come back and rescue him. Then another one of the brothers, Judah, saw an opportunity, and he's like, let's sell him into slavery. But in order for God to position Joseph to where he needed to be, he had to get him out of the situation where his brothers wanted him dead. It's toxic to live in a situation where people want you dead. God got him out of that situation and put him in one where he could develop his leadership skills. But then he was thrown in jail. How was that good? Yeah, he worked his way up to be chief of staff of Potiphar, but why didn't God just continue to give him influence in that situation so that he would eventually be able to help his family? Well, God had to teach him how to lead. During that time, he was around all those officials in Potiphar's house. He was learning the forms of government. He was seeing how things work, and he was learning to be a servant to a very important person. It was almost a miniature version, a scaled-down version of what his life would be a few years later. But he had to go through all of that so he could be prepared for where God was going to place him. And he got him out of that situation before his witness was ruined. If he had stuck around with Potiphar's wife, no telling what would have happened. I can tell you what would have happened. If he really had slept with Potiphar's wife, he would have been executed. And I think Potiphar knew what his wife was up to, but he kind of had to side with her. So he was thrown into jail. God got him out of this toxic situation and put him in jail. Is that an upgrade over death? Yes. But if he hadn't gone to jail, he wouldn't have been set up with the opportunity to start interpreting dreams again. He had been given dreams when he was a kid, but he hadn't, as far as the text goes, there's not been any more dreams that Joseph had in over 20 years since those dreams that he had as a kid. When he was sent to prison, it was to protect him from the situation at Potiphar's house, but it was also setting him up so that he could begin to interpret dreams again. God reopened that gift within him, and while interpreting dreams, that put him back on the radar. Now, this is the hard one, but it's most important here. It was 2 years after the butler got out of prison before he remembered Joseph. 2 years. I mentioned the pain you feel when you realize that you've forgotten something pretty important. It's a punch in the gut. Oh, man, I forgot that. Man, I really wanted to call that person on their birthday, or I really wanted to do this, or I said I was going to be somewhere and I wasn't there. It's just that pain of forgetting. But it was 2 years. Let's take a look at this, though. I am of the mindset that God erased that from his memory. That the butler, the cupbearer, he just kind of, God moved it and tucked it in the corner of his mind, only to come back when it was necessary. Because what happens? He gets out of prison. He goes to Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, there's this guy in prison that interpreted dreams. I think you should let him out. And Pharaoh lets him out, and what ends up happening? There's not a whole lot for an ex-con to do in Egypt at that moment. What's he going to do? Go right back into being a servant somewhere? No, so it was 2 years that he had to wait before Pharaoh had dreams. He had to stay in prison until Pharaoh had the dream. It would have been difficult for him on the outside. He was forgotten so that God could position him to answer Pharaoh's dream when the time was right. So then he answers, the cupbearer remembers. Pharaoh brings him, he translates the dream, interprets the dream. He gets out of prison, steps into the best job in the kingdom. God used that time of forgetting to position Joseph for where he needed to be. He was forgotten by his family over 20 years when he was learning the skills needed to become a leader in a foreign land. Learning the language. Not only learning how to understand it, but learning how to speak it. Learning the posture. Egyptian culture was completely different than Hebrew culture. So he had to not only keep in mind who he was and who he was created to be, he had to learn how to survive and thrive in an Egyptian culture. God was with him every day, every step of the way, and he grew in his influence and his ability. He got to a point, everything's great, he finds himself in prison. God is taking him to another place to learn something else. And during that time of waiting, God was with him. And in those times of forgetting, God was positioning Joseph to be exactly where he needed him to be. Could it be that today, in your situation, whatever is going on in your mind, that you may feel forgotten, or maybe you genuinely have It's not just a feeling. Maybe you have been forgotten by somebody. We can look at that and see, God, are you positioning me for something that you have for me? I've been forgotten by my family. I've been forgotten by friends. I've been forgotten by whatever. God, are you trying to show me something here? I haven't been forgotten by you, so are you setting me up for what you're doing? Take that approach when you have that forgotten pain. You've been overlooked, and that hurt. But God has something in you or something for you down the road that you wouldn't even recognize if you hadn't been forgotten the first time around. We can't see the whole picture. I've said it before, if God would show you the whole plan, you'd turn around and run scared. I like to know. I want to know the plan. I like to see. I want to know the end result when I begin something. And I have a destination in my own personal life and my goals for being a husband and a father, for being a minister, a pastor. But I know, and here's how I know that I would run scared if God showed me the whole thing. Because I think back. And if God showed me what my life would look like today, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, I'd been married for 3 years. Lindsay and I just celebrated our 23rd anniversary. I'd been married for 3 years. We had 2 kids at the time, and I was a youth pastor. We were in ministry. We enjoyed what we were doing. If 20 years ago, God said, you're going to pastor in Dundee. I was familiar with Dundee. I'm from Polk County. Said, you're going to pastor in Dundee. You're going to have 5 children. One of them you're going to adopt. And so many other things in my life. I would have said, that's you got the wrong guy, God. Lindsay and I agreed before we got married. We settled on 3 kids because I wanted 2 and she wanted no less than 17. She's from a big family. I'm from a family. It was just me and my sister. So we compromised on 3. And God laughed. You want to make God smile? Tell him your plans. I would have turned around and run scared. So I know 20 years later where I am right now. If the Lord does not come back or call me home in the next 20 years, as much as I want to know plans, I really don't want to know what 20 years from now looks like. I'll be 68 years old. I'll have grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren by then. I don't know. But what I do know is that he's with me every step of the way. And he will reveal sometimes only one step at a time. And here's what he expects. In the moments when you are with family and everything seems good, trust him for that next step. Obey. When you find yourself in a pit, betrayed and rejected by the ones you love, trust him and obey and take one more step. And then when you find yourself sold off into slavery or you find yourself at the bottom of the influence level, trust him and obey and take one more step. And for 20 years, he learned and he stepped. But it was still 2 more years in prison before God would lead him out. So that takes place. He's now been gone 22 years. And the time of blessing has come. And we'll get to what happens at that next week. But when we encounter these things in life, it's difficult because you can only see the next step. You don't have a big LED shine light that can show the whole way. But if his word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, that next step may be all that we see. Joseph was sold into slavery. He couldn't see so many steps ahead where he would be the second most powerful person in the most powerful nation on earth. When you feel forgotten, all you see is the bad stuff because that's what's right in front of you. When you feel forgotten, you can't see the blessing on the other side of the pain. But understand, in the midst of that pain, He is with you. And if you could see your path in the eyes of God, you would be able to see that while you may be forgotten today, God is positioning you for what happens tomorrow. He's setting you up. He's teaching you things. Every step along the way, you learn things. In that 20 years that I referenced a moment ago, I worked for a number of pastors. I was a youth pastor and served in different churches. And sometimes I worked for really good people. Sometimes I worked for people that, praise the Lord, that I hope they're going to heaven. But I learned from the best people I worked for to the worst people I worked for, I've always learned. God took me through these seasons, and He taught me every lesson to set me up for where I am today. And the trials that I face today, the struggles that I have right now, even in my moments of weakness, physically, emotionally, I know I can rest on Him because I know something's going to happen in the future that I'm going to look back and say, that time in late March of 2025 when I was struggling with that thing, now in whatever this time date is in the future, I understand that. I was drugged through the mud so that I could come out clean on the other side. I was sent through the fire so I could become purified and be gold. I was being prepared so that I could help lead others that have a struggle that I wouldn't know about until I had been through it. See it through the eyes of God. He's going to work in you in a way that He's the one that gets the glory for it. Will you stand?
Good morning, RCC. My name is Blaine, and today I'm going to bring you the good news. This Friday, April 4th, our ladies will be meeting at Chili's in Lake Wales for Ladies Night Out. If you're looking for a refreshing time away, make sure to RSVP your spot at the table before you leave. Guys, don't worry, we haven't forgotten about you. On April 12th, we're having our men's Bible study. Come hang out, enjoy breakfast as we dive into our current study, The Gospeller by Willie Robertson. Just like the ladies, we also need you to register as well so that we know exactly how much food to prepare. We can't wait to see you there. On Saturday, April 5th, we are having a work day here at the church to ensure that everything is looking good for Easter Sunday. We need your help to prepare our property and make it look the best it can for all of our guests that will be in attendance. Easter is known as the time of year where a lot of people come back to church or they go for the very first time. When you show up to help, you are becoming a part of someone else's salvation story. From every piece of trash that gets picked up and to every smile that is given on Easter Sunday morning, you are preparing the way for someone to make Jesus the Lord of their life. Community Kitchen is happening soon. Immediately after service today, we're having a brief meeting regarding our upcoming Community Kitchen dates. If you're someone who regularly serves at Community Kitchen, then this meeting is just for you. Today, this meeting will happen in Classroom 2. It's the classroom located directly behind the coffee shop. We'll see you there. Every year we have a special service on Palm Sunday during Rich Kids. We have special games, a time of worship, and we even have an egg hunt for every age group. We are looking forward to how all of our kids will be impacted by the gospel on this day. The church, we need your help. This day would not be possible without you. Over the next few weeks, you will find a barrel located in the lobby where you can drop off candy donations for this event. Thank you, church, for supporting Rich Kids. All right, RCC, that's been the good news. Make sure on your way out today, you stop by the welcome desk so that you can sign up for all of these great events and so many more that we have, like baptism and the upcoming Ridge Runners event, the Bye-Bye Breakfast. Make sure you stop by and get some more information, or you go online to www.rccog.org/events and you can sign up there as well. Why don't you go ahead, stand your feet all across the room, find somebody you haven't spoken to this morning, give them a big high five, and we'll be right back with the word from our pastor.